All right, and today I'm actually going to talk about promises. As you can see, I changed the title a tiny bit. Originally was like promises, the good and the bad parts, but since it's promises, I believed and the title is actually nicer like this, and I changed it to that. It's also going to be mainly about Node Core, just in general, how Core deals with promises. In Node Core, it looked more like this. So that's not really a love story, right? You don't really like each other. And that's why we don't have native promise support until now. It's mainly you have the callbacks all the time. That's how Node Core dealt with it. Why is it that way? Well, callbacks are super fast, for example. And that's one of the reasons why we didn't implement promises earlier. Another reason was that when Node came up, it was in 2009, while native promises were spec'd with ES6, and that's in 2015, right? So we had to wait a long time until this came up, even though there was the promise A spec before. And there are more reasons for that, because you can actually do a couple of mistakes. But promises are cool, right? Everyone loves promises. They are simple to use, they make your application flow nice and easy, and now with async await there as well, it's like super clear code, and it's dense, it's readable, you know what's happening. And for example, here, to make it, to just have a small example, with the application code up there, you have the read file, the original one, and there's the callback, you handle the error, and you get the result, you do some validation function, and call the callback of that function. All right, below, it's way more straightforward, right? It's an async function, so it will return a promise all the time, and we can use await, and we use the promises wait version that is now in Node 10. It's still experimental, and it changed a lot. So originally, what was implemented with the dot notation, as it is right now, I used destructuring here. And then it was changed actually to be your own module. Then it was changed back to the way it is right now. So I don't recommend to use that right now already, besides for trying it out. Actually, please try it out, because we still have some bugs in there, and we want to fix them before Node 10 becomes LTS, and of course also before we want to let everyone use the native promise API. So in Core, we have these promise implementations so far. I was just talking about FS, so the file system module. And since today, version 10.6, we have DNS. It's pretty cool. So it's also experimental, similar to that. Please try it out, but not in production. And besides that, we have two functions in Cert. If you have ever used the Cert module, it also has two functions called Cert throws and a Cert does not throw. Well, since I think Node 10 as well, there were two functions added to that, so you can also deal with promises now. And that's Cert rejects and Cert does not reject. So that's pretty handy. Then util promissify is something I can recommend to use every one of you, because you have callback APIs where you use a module and you actually manually probably transform that into a promise API if your application works with promises. But you don't want to do that. It's error prone, and instead you can just use this tiny handy function and it will deal with all of that. Even if it is a complicated function that is a non-standard callback, you can still add a specific handler, so it would be so it would result in a nice promise afterwards. And we are adding more and more stuff to Node Core, especially every async module or every async operation will at some point probably be there as native promise implementation. Now we come to the mistakes that someone can easily do with or run into when dealing with promises. And one of these is, for example, a non-finished promise chain. You don't return in line 7. In line 7, it would be a runaway promise. And in case there's an error, while trying to write this file, for example, you had a permission error or whatsoever, and then this error would not be caught, even though you have the catch handler right below, right? It looks fine. Code looks awesome. No, it's not. Because it's actually going to end up in something very nice. It's called unhandled rejection. Below, and the API is a bit more tricky. So here someone tries to promisify an API, and it has a couple of cool pits in there. So we call this callback API in line 16, and we deal with the error, right? We call reject in case an error occurs. Great. But with promises, you don't end right away in this case. You just silence everything afterwards. So afterwards, the code continues to run, and you would call the sync API afterwards. It does whatever. We don't know. Maybe it has side effects. Maybe it doesn't. And then it calls resolve as well. The promise would still be rejected, but this would not be noticed otherwise. And for this case, for example, if sync API would not throw, you would just call reject and resolve. You would think everything is fine. But this is pretty uncool because you should never do both at the same time, right? We are not like shooting as cat, sorry. I'm German. And the other case is if you didn't get the error, well, it is even worse. In that case, you would skip the error handling, wonderful. But let's say you actually have an error in the sync API. Then the application would terminate at this point. Well, it would not terminate, but the resolve call would not be called anymore. And then the promise would never be resolved at all. It would not be rejected or resolved, and you have a memory leak. And we definitely want to prevent that. So errors are swallowed, and this is something pretty bad. And we get the unhandled rejections, right? I mean, no one wants to have a rejection. You could also call it, well, not getting over date gone wrong. In Node Core, that's not true, however, because we have these warnings. If you have an unhandled rejection, and you could either add a so-called unhandled rejection hook, or you could just don't do it, and then you get warnings and deprecation messages. Very scary, you know. It says like, your process is going to exit with a non-zero exit code. Okay, that's not true. It's complete not true. Yeah? This is never going to be the default. Why? Because we cannot just end the application. It's written that way originally because it is probably the best way to deal with it, but we cannot just force the users to do something by default. And that's why it's not done that way. I'm going to go into more details about it a little bit later. So here I have another example for unhandled rejections. And so this code actually looks pretty fine, right? We do things, and then we call a foobar, and we assign that to A. That's a promise, because foobar is an async function. Okay, we reject, but who cares at the moment? And then we call bus, and bus is an async function. So we have another promise, awesome. And then we actually deal with the errors, right? Because we wrap that in a try-catch, as we do with async code. Well, the problem is we await A first. And in this case, because A was already rejected, the other code is not going to be called anymore, so we never get to await B. And await B will not be handled due to that, even though it looks like it is actually handled. This is, of course, a simplified function and something where you see, okay, well, this is probably not what you should do. But just imagine the function would be bigger in your actual application, and this could actually happen. And that's what will be printed out next to it. It's an unhandled promise rejection warning, because we don't have a hook that would deal with those errors. And we end up in a debugging horror, because we don't have a proper stack trace, etc. But, oh, there's a word. We want to be happy, right? We don't want to have a debugging horror. We want to smile. So Node Core is going to implement a couple of new modes. I actually wrote a PR, my third turn on it, because it is like we iterate over it for a long time about the specific implementation. And to make everyone happy, we decided on implementing 4 different modes. And I'm now going to show you what these modes are actually for to deal with unheralded rejections. The first one is silent. I highly recommend against using this ever, because it will just silence any noise that is coming from Node. Right now you get a deprecation message in case you have no hook, and you get the warning itself. So that's at least a tiny bit of debugging information. But in this case, nothing would be printed at all if you use this. And therefore memory leaks, etc. would be just hidden. And you have the warning mode. So with warn, you would be pretty much there where you are right now in Node, just you don't get the deprecation message anymore. So there's not really a benefit doing this. And I wouldn't recommend to use this mode ever either. Then we have the cert mode, and that's going to be hopefully the standard in Node.js 11. It's the, even though my PR is almost done, I'm not yet there to land it. And there might be still some tiny changes, but it's unlikely that any of this, what I'm talking about, is going to change. And with error on GC, it means on garbage collection. On garbage collection is something that will probably at least detect a few real mistakes in your application, because it means there's no strong reference to the promise that rejected. And therefore, we are absolutely sure this is a rejection that is never handled anywhere in the application. So we have no false negatives. And that's super important. And that's why this is going to be the default in Node Core and nothing else. But with garbage collection, this is also happening pretty late in the application. And you actually want to know errors early on, right? You want to have a notification that something's wrong pretty fast. So that's why I don't recommend this mode either, even though it's going to help you out in some cases. But even if you have an unhandled rejection that is also that does not have any strong reference, your application might already be done and just closes down before the promise would be garbage collected, and you would not get any notification in that case. So it's it's not a strong mode yet, but we want to have a strong mode, right? We want to be the hero. And that's why we have the error case. And with the error case, so it will trigger on the next tick of an unhandled rejection. It's the first time we detect it. Otherwise, we are not able to detect if a promise is actually handled or not. I'm not sure how deep you are into this topic, but there is no certainty that this promise would not be handled later on. It is only a notification about, okay, this promise did definitely not have a rejection, a catch handler on the next tick. And that should already be enough and that you know, okay, something is weird going on and I should actually shut down my application, because now I'm in an undefined state, similar to when an exception occurs in your application. And if something like that happens, you should just close down. And that's what I'm doing in this example. So you even have a reference to it, right? So that's not the point, because we push the rejection right away into the cache, and the cache will be there until the end of the application. And then we have the set timeout to actually trigger it. Otherwise, the application would also just immediately end, because there's nothing more that it continues to run the event loop. And if there is nothing in the event loop going on, the process would actually just close down, because that's how Node itself works. And then with the process on uncaught exception handler, that's what is going to be triggered with the error thing. And that's super important. We don't, the unhandled rejection hook that I spoke about earlier is not impacted by the new modes at all. In case an error is thrown either by the error on GC or by the error mode, it will actually cause a regular exception. And with regular exceptions, you could, of course, also continue running your code, but you should not. But to distinguish the synchronous regular exceptions from the rest, well, there's going to be a second argument, and that is going to tell you where it's coming from. And you won't have any memory leaks using this or something like that. You know, okay, something weird is going on, I have to fix this right away, and just close your application. So this is why the spooky deprecation message says your process is going to crash. But we want to be in control. We want to handle our errors, and therefore just please use the new modes as soon as they're there. They're also going to be backported in this case to Node 10 and 8 at least. And then you can opt into using those. So you have different ways of opting in. And one is by using an environment variable, node unhandled rejection. And you assign the specific mode that you want to use. Or you use the runtime flag, unhandled rejection, and set the mode. So I decided to go for both, so actually more people will opt into using it, because I highly recommend to always deal with those. It's pretty bad if you don't shut down your application on unhandled rejections. Yeah, and I already told you earlier that rejection hooks won't be impacted at all. To give you an outlook, what is planned in Node Core in the future is just today, Benedikt Meurer, one of the developers of Google working on V8, and developed something that we asked for to give you more debugging information. And that will mean we are able to probably also tell you if, for example, what the promise constructor issue that I showed you earlier, that it would swallow the second call to resolve or reject. Well, we could notify you about this in the future as well. So that's pretty cool. And we are going to try to improve the debugging experience in general for all the developers using Node Core. Then what we are also doing, every API is pretty much getting stricter and stricter validations to make sure it's easier to use and to run into less errors. And we are going to add the native promise support and give the user the choice how to deal with some things, especially when it comes to the promises. So thank you all for having me, and please ask me questions.
Questions? Okay, all the way back. Could you guys pass or throw it a little bit? Can you catch? Okay.
Hello. I have a question. Can we have your thoughts about the Ryan Dale's talk? Like the things that he regretted about Node. Thank you.
Well, that's a bit off topic, I would say. Let's postpone that to maybe some other questions, if there are any other questions. No one?
Any other questions?
Thanks a lot for the talk. You showed an example with the file system calls that you forgot to return at some point. Will that be handled by the error mode as well?
Yeah, so in case you don't return, it would be an unhandled rejection, and any unhandled rejection would actually be triggered or would result in an error in case you use the error mode.
Okay. And I had another question. You used the unhandled exception event to notify about errors. Did you think about creating another event just for that? Instead?
Oh, you mean a Cert API? No. It's already bad that we have it in the core. And we don't want to give you more things like that. So yes, we did overload it. And yes, we could use a different API. But it is an exception. And the process should be should deal with it similar to any other exception. And some historical stuff about it. So with promises, why is the spec actually so weird the way it is? Because it was written with the browsers in mind. And with browsers, it's super important that your application keeps on running. Otherwise, your user experience would be horrible, and you don't want the user to leave your page even if you have a minor mistake in your application. Well, that's not the case on server side. When you have a server, you always want to deal with all your exceptions because you are in full control over everything, and you want to make sure the application is actually running the way you think it is. If it is not, then please deal with those errors and fix them. And that's why the spec allows the application to keep on running with unhandled rejections, while it's not meant to be that way with regular exceptions.
Makes sense. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Any more questions? Okay.
All right, now then I'll talk about Ryan Dahl. So first of all, a lot of the things that Ryan Dahl spoke about is something that Node Core is already planning to do, at least partially. And it sometimes has some historical reasons why it's slow. You don't want to break the whole ecosystem and stuff like that. There are a few things that cannot be done, but it's like, I think he had like 10 points, right? And probably like 3 could not be implemented in Node Core. And in the end, it was just an advertisement talk for his new product. Yeah. Anyone else? No? Well, feel free to ask me something afterwards if you want to. Thanks a lot.